It isn't only in Britain that spring this year has taken everyone by surprise. Here, in the Ticino, on the borders of Switzerland and Italy, the slopes overlooking Lake Lugano have already burst into flower, at least a fortnight earlier than usual. But what, you may ask, has the early and welcome arrival of bees and blossom to do with food? Well, it's simply that the past winter, one of the mildest in living memory, has had its effect in other ways as well. Most important of all, it's resulted in an exceptionally heavy spaghetti crop. The last 2 weeks of March are an anxious time for the spaghetti farmer. There's always the chance of a late frost, which, while not entirely ruining the crop, generally impairs the flavor and makes it difficult for him to obtain top prices in world markets. But now these dangers are over, and the spaghetti harvest goes forward. Spaghetti cultivation here in Switzerland is not, of course, carried out on anything like the tremendous scale of the Italian industry. Many of you, I'm sure, will have seen pictures of the vast spaghetti plantations in the Po Valley. For the Swiss, however, it tends to be more of a family affair. Another reason why this may be a bumper year lies in the virtual disappearance of the spaghetti weevil, the tiny creature whose depredations have caused much concern in the past. After picking, the spaghetti is laid out to dry in the warm alpine sun. Many people are often puzzled by the fact that spaghetti is produced at such uniform length, but this is the result of many years of patient endeavor by plant breeders who've succeeded in producing the perfect spaghetti. And now, the harvest is marked by a traditional meal. Toasts to the new crop are drunk in these poccolinos, and then the waiters enter bearing the ceremonial dish. And it is, of course, spaghetti, picked earlier in the day, dried in the sun, and so brought fresh from garden to table at the very peak of condition. For those who love this dish, there's nothing like real homegrown spaghetti.
Richard Dimbleby's famous spoof film of 1957, complete with a straight-faced BBC English voiceover, was broadcast on television at prime time and was taken seriously by a credible British public. Even though the date was the 1st of April. The film drew on the truth that, to most Britons, Europe, the continent, was a strange and foreign place, especially in relation to food. It showed something of the knowledge gap that had to be overcome by those who were convinced that the future of Britain lay in economic and political collaboration with Europe, and who wanted the British people to support the project. And informing the British people about facts, rather than airing assertions and half-truths, has always been a difficult task. The Treaty of Rome was signed in 1957. This instituted the European Economic Community of 6 members: France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. Britain would not become a member until 1973. It was excluded at first by its own aloofness, and then, when it finally did apply for membership, by a series of French vetoes. When the EEC wanted to promote itself to the British, the task was given to typographers and information designers, explaining the real Europe in facts and figures. The London design group Banks+Miles undertook much of this work, and this presentation focuses on material from their archive at the Department of Typography and Graphic Communication at the University of Reading. Banks+Miles are a significant part of British design culture, partly because of the importance of their client list: London Transport, the Post Office, British Telecom, a number of universities, and both Oxford and Cambridge University presses, but also because of their approach to design. They were designers with a social mission to improve everyday design in lasting ways, and they were designers with a social and ecological conscience. And to typographers, they remain the type-based design studio par excellence. Almost all of their major corporate identities take their cue from a customized or original typeface. The design firm began in the year following the Treaty of Rome, 1958. Colin Banks and John Miles had met when they were both students at Maidstone College of Art. John Miles recalls, "We took up typography because we thought we'd make the world a better place. There was a huge amount of idealism in the early 1950s. Before they set up their central London basement studio, Banks had worked with a number of typographers, including Ernest Hoch, and Miles had been assistant to Hans Schmoller at Penguin Books. And before then, he'd had a placement at Enschede in the Netherlands on a United Nations traveling scholarship. The idealism that Miles refers to is revealed by their client list, with groups such as the Consumer Association, the Campaign for Racial Equality, and the magazine Censorship. And while Miles was a skillful book designer, Banks was quite at home designing engineering firms' magazines and newsletters. Neither thought that a graphic designer should be afraid of designing diagrams, graphs, and tables. They did work for many large commercial businesses, such as Associated Television and IBM, but clients such as the innovative and design-led engineering firm Molten Bicycles was a natural fit for them. The kinds of books that John Miles worked on included school histories and geographies, always books that were full of illustrations, maps, charts, and diagrams. The year 1964 saw the start of Banks and Miles' long association with the Consumers Association, designing and producing their publication, Which. Now, Which was a work that constituted an extended experiment in information design for the newly consumerist British middle class. Post-war affluence was bringing a range of new gadgets and appliances, holidays and financial services into the reach of a wider public. And without the entree to information that professionals provided to the upper class, and potentially confused by the explosion of consumer durables on the market, the middle class turned to Which so that they could spend their hard-earned money wisely. Was the cheapest room heater, tape recorder, or little black dress a bargain, or was it a rip-off? The Which Best Buy list and its charts of product features, whose key was the more blobs, the better, passed into public consciousness, at least in the middling stratum of society. In 1994, the sociologist Alan Aldridge described Which as a lifestyle guide in which rational consumption and the rational consumer are socially constructed. Which repudiates the irrationalist, anti-enlightenment thrust of postmodernism. It concentrates on use value, brackets ethical and aesthetic considerations, treats consumption as a serious matter to be approached with self-discipline, searches for the reality underlying appearances, and promotes confidence in independent, rationally organized expert systems. The information graphics in Which may not have had the level of rigor and idealism of, say, ATypI, but they were always straightforward and clear and pragmatic. This is design that exactly suits its audience, which wanted sufficient evidence to make a choice and a balance between too much and too little information. And it certainly wasn't interested in graphic design for its own sake. Banks and Miles also understood the limitations of printing processes, and the magazine was designed to be produced quickly and efficiently. And there are parallels between Banks and Miles' work for the European communities and for Which. But the connection with Europe was based on chance. And John Miles explained to me how it arose. In the early days of the partnership, Colin and I decided to visit the Brussels Expo. We traveled in Colin's Isetta bubble car, together with his then girlfriend. I remember we sat very cheek to cheek. We couldn't afford to stay in Brussels, so we popped over the border to the Netherlands. We thought we might drum up some work from Enschede. We got a series of poetry books to design and a poster, and then we called on the office of the European Communities in The Hague. And their nice Mr. Klomp regretted he could do nothing for us, but suggested we get in touch with the London office and with Roy Price. Now, this nice Mr. Klomp was Johannes Gerhardus Klomp. He ran the press and information department of the European Communities in The Hague. And Roy Price, who'd originally been an academic, was associated with the Federal Trust, This was a British political ginger group that campaigned for European political integration. Banks+Miles ended up designing, producing, and indeed publishing Price's 1962 book, The Political Future of the European Community, under the imprint John Marshbank, which was an invented name. This volume was important in arguing that the European project needed to embrace a political union to escape declining into mere bureaucracy. Price became the London Press and Information Officer of the European Communities in London and the editor of their journal, European Community. This was a monthly roundup of news about the communities, including serious news articles by independent journalists. It was mailed out to firms, government departments and agencies, and, importantly, to schools and colleges. And I have to admit this is where I came in, because in 1968, I was studying economics at A-level, and I had to dutifully read European Community every month. The journal needed to change printer, and this gave Banks+Miles their opportunity. They had a close relationship with the West Country firm of Edwin Snell, who had exactly the capacity for magazine production required. They got the job, and this set a long-term relationship in place. The last European item bearing the imprint Snell print in our archive is dated 1993. In late 1968, two format changes were made to European Community. The page size was changed to match the new Post Office preferred sizes of envelopes so that it would reduce postage costs, and the paper stock changed from newsprint to a blade-coated art. This transformed the possibilities of graphic design in the magazine. Newsprint really only allowed typographic display, and it was punishing for halftones, and the show-through was particularly poor. The blade-coated art allowed a change from a headline and text style to a more confident graphic style. While neither the covers nor the internal design of European Communities reached the heights established by Which, the publications had similarities, partly because John Miles was the partner responsible for both publications. First was the choice of display typeface. Univer was the most widely available of the new grotesques in Britain at the time. In the 1960s, Helvetica was available as Letraset and from a few London trade typesetting houses, but it was nothing like as ubiquitous with most printers in the UK as Univer, because Monotype had issued a large range of weights and sizes in that face. Both European Community and Which were typeset hot metal, and while the printing of Which was done by lithography, European Community was printed letterpress. The plain, practical approach of Banks+Miles to text typefaces is seen in their choice of Ionic, and later Univer for Which, and Times New Roman for European Community. The covers of Which developed from being busy with cover lines to simpler, bolder graphic images. This growing confidence in simplicity was possible because Which, like European Community, had a subscription-only circulation. There was no need for cover lines to shout out the issue's contents on newsstands. The covers could become bolder and more graphic. Both Which and European Community incorporate many graphs and tables. Now, these were certainly more assured in the consumer magazine than they were in European Community. And this is probably down to the rather complex production process that was involved. Again, John Miles remembers, the monthly production of European Community, for which we were paid the princely sum of 20 guineas, was a perfect example of the complexity of production compared to today's digital world, particularly when the editor moved to Brussels. We picked up galleys from Waterloo, and they were taken by me by the night train to Brussels, where I made up the pages with the editor, incorporating the necessary changes, and then back to London on the night train and pasted up the pasted up pages for the printer, then final page proofs and agreeing corrections over the telephone. Other publications for Europe included The Common Market and The Common Man. The cover of The Common Market and The Common Man includes a reminder of the political realities of the time, indeed a reminder of the need for the whole European project. Any map of the EEC had to include the detached island of West Berlin, which was surrounded by the Communist East, but of course was still part of the EEC. As a counterbalance, to the serious political intention of these publications, a lightness of touch, also a Banks+Miles characteristic, is evidence. John Miles again. The whole thing was ready to go to press, where they decided it was a bit heavy going and needed something to liven it up. And they asked me on a Friday afternoon if I could find a cartoonist to deliver by the following Monday. I really didn't know any cartoonists, and certainly none who would be willing to give up their weekend for such a modest fee. So I did them myself. All the early European publications, and which, and work for IBM, were designed to be printed in only 2 colours. European Community was limited to black plus a standard bright red, but which was designed with a palette of bright, bold colours that contrast with the black text. 4-colour printing was out of the question in this period for subscription magazines and journals produced on a budget. But the limitation had its advantages. In contrast to the boldness and straightforward charm of the 2-colour graphics from the 1960s, the 4-colour publications that were designed for Europe in the 1980s and 1990s do seem rather less vibrant. Banks+Miles carried on designing European Community for about 10 years, until the early 1970s. Roy Price had moved up the European hierarchy and eventually was named Director of the Information Directorate. And as a result, more work followed for Banks+Miles. In 1976, their job was to publicise the work of the European Parliament, which was then still an appointed rather than an elected body. One of the new challenges this presented was multilingual production, in contrast to European Community, which of course had only been in English. And Banks+Miles was commissioned to produce this booklet for distribution across Europe with variants in the national languages, all of which were printed in the Netherlands. In 1979, the first direct elections to the European Parliament took place, and a schools information campaign was required. There'd been a schools information campaign which Banks+Miles had designed earlier in the 60s, which involved a travelling exhibition. Here are some photographs of the maquette that was produced for it. In 1979, to advertise the direct elections to a schools audience, a series of slide packs were distributed. To publicise the date of the election itself, each nation in the community was required to present a national campaign, which would run in parallel across the continent. Banks+Miles were permissioned to produce the British campaign, and John Miles remembers, the entries reflected national attitudes. The French was rather philosophical and a bit gnomic. Ours was very down-to-earth and practical. But the Irish, who were benefiting enormously from membership of the EU, produced a hilariously funny version. Now, it's one of the disappointments of the archive that we only hold the pragmatic, ordinary British version that Banks+Miles did. The British campaign, however, did require Asian language variants, and I think it's salutary to look back at the paucity of typographic resources for setting these in this period. It really was relying on not very good hand-drawn lettering. Gradually, the work from the European community is reduced as the relevant personnel moved on or retired. The direct contacts that had sustained strong relationships between client, designers, and printers began to fall away. One strategy used by Banks+Miles in order to retain the relationship was to establish a Brussels office, which was run by the designer Jan van Son. This resulted in one important publication, the summary of the report of the Commission to the UN Earth Summit in Rio in 1992. This was at a time when the John Major government in Britain was having problems from the Eurosceptic bastards in the cabinet. Now, this little booklet emphasises its Euro credentials with the design imprint Banks+Miles Brussels and a colophon that stresses that it was set and printed in Belgium on recycled paper. But the Belgian office was always a bit of a financial liability, despite the advantage that the EU paid 30% of the fees up front, including the printer's charges, and it eventually had to close. Banks+Miles closed their own studio in London in 1996, with the partners continuing on their own project. And this was when I was lucky enough to work with Colin Banks on the OUP corporate identity before he died in 2002. The European adventure that began for Banks+Miles in that little Isetta bubble car in the late 1950s had lasted almost the entire life of the firm. If the European glory days were earlier in that history, then perhaps this can be explained by the particular kind of creativity that is fostered by having to work to furious deadlines with limited resources. And although a full corporate style for the European communities was mooted on occasions, it never materialized, so each design idea could be considered afresh. What remains in the Reading archive is, I think, a valuable reminder of this simpler, straightforward, manual way of working from half a century ago. Designers are very much in charge here, not marketeers. These were publications based on facts and less on propaganda. There's a direct relationship between the authors and the editors and the designers. And printers are a key part of the equation. They're a constant partner. They're not just someone to dump your PDFs on after the final client sign-off. I mentioned Banks+Miles typeface design work. I thought I'd just show you a couple of slides to treat you to some reminders of that work. The collection at Reading contains a mass of proposals, artwork, and proofs of the double-line alphabet for the Post Office and of New Johnston for London Transport, and some other typefaces that were designed for other clients. The artwork for the Post Office alphabet shows the skill and knowledge that the studio developed in optically correcting geometrical letter forms to function as type. And this slide shows the adjusted radius centers that were required. And all these were done on hand-drawn pen and ink artwork. Also, here's John Marles' own sketchbook, which has got both flights of fancy and design proposals for alphabets from the late 1960s onwards. This page shows the sketch that eventually became the Post Office double-line alphabet many years later, alongside proposals for variants of which and other journals that they published. There's even a proposal for ATypI itself. I hope this little talk has indicated some of the riches of materials and the wealth of stories that can be unearthed from design archives. Because the silent evidence of archives need to be leavened with the oral history of those who take part, I'd particularly like to thank John Marles for so willingly sharing his recollections of those bygone days, days when Britain truly did go into Europe. Thank you.